So let's get right to our panel. Joining us from Rome via Skype is Ambassador Gideon Meir. During his long diplomatic career, he served as consul and administration officer for the Israeli embassy here in Washington, D.C., was a member of the negotiating team that drafted Israel's peace treaty with Egypt too. And Avi Bell is a law professor at Israel's Bartland University and the University of San Diego in California. And with us from Jerusalem is Jeremy Saltan. He is a conservative political commentator and member of Bayit Yehudi, one of Israel's religious parties. And joining us from New York is the Jerusalem Post senior commentator, Amotz Asa-El. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Let's speak to you, Amotz, first of all. Obviously, the press really enjoying all this. Bribes, fraud, breach of trust. These are serious allegations. How much trouble is Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, in?
It's clearly a very multi-pronged front that he faces. No one is in a position to say where this is exactly headed legally speaking, but publicly speaking, his situation is very grave, particularly considering that he has been abandoned by two of his closest aides who are now standing to be state witnesses, and he's also been probably in contrast to his own calculations. He faces, he's confronted by the chief of Israel police, who was his own appointment and comes from his own milieu. And despite this background and despite that context, is now effectively leading the charge that Netanyahu faces.
Ambassador Meir, is he in trouble? I mean, is he going to go, do you think?
I think it's too early. It's too early to tell. First of all, Israel is a separation of power. Before he has to go, he has to be indicted. And there's no decision yet of the Attorney General that he's going to be indicted. So there's a process in Israel, a very clear process of democracy, which has a separation of power between the executive, the legislative, and of course the legal system. And we have to wait, because there are two processes here. One is the legal process, the other one is the political process. And according to the political process in Israel, the Prime Minister doesn't have to resign before the verdict of the court. And not only the verdict of the court, also if there's going to be an appeal, we will have to wait until the appeal will take place with the Supreme Court.
So he could stay in office, Ambassador, even if he's indicted, even if he's facing these charges?
Theoretically, yes, because this is the law. Because I tell you why. Because if the Prime Minister will go to court and he will be non-guilty, he was elected by the people of Israel, this is going to create a dilemma. And therefore, the legislation in Israel is as such that allows the Prime Minister, and we are talking from the legal point of view, not from the moral point of view. From the legal point of view, he can stay in office until the entire legal process is over.
That's a good point. Jeremy, you're in Jerusalem. You're feeling the pulse of Israeli politics. What about this moral view? Because even though politically he could stay, is public opinion starting to turn against him?
Well, we just had a poll that came out today in the Israel Hayom newspaper. That poll gives the Likud 34 seats. That's 4 seats more than they have today. The Bayit Yehudi party goes up from 8 seats to 14. Overall, the coalition partners of the Netanyahu government go up to 70 seats in this poll. In fact, if you look at an average of the 8 polls that have been conducted during the year of 2018, you'll see that the stronger the allegations and investigations and the police recommendations are in terms of causing what would seem to be damage towards Netanyahu, in fact, his public support ends up increasing.
Jeremy, though, the polls suggest perhaps something different. 60%, according to recent polls, of Israelis feel that Netanyahu's ability to run Israel is harmed by what's going on. 48% in some polls say that he is corrupt. Public opinion moving against him?
Well, you know, that's the interesting thing. If you look at the polls, there's a big discrepancy. If you look at the polls in terms of where the seats are divided if we were to go to an election today versus stuff that have to do with Netanyahu directly. Now, to explain that type of situation, you have to understand that again, the Likud today, even if they were to win something like 30 seats, 34 seats, that would still only be about a quarter, a little over a quarter of the parliament. It's really the fact that a lot of people in Netanyahu's coalition, a lot of the parties such as the Kulanu party led by Moshe Kachlon that are remaining in this coalition, that really allows Netanyahu to be able to move and continue forward.
Okay, I want to talk about the politics a little bit more later, but Amotz, I want to bring you in. This scandal seems big from all the way over here. How is it being felt in Israel, is in terms of all the scandals that you've had in Israeli politics, and there's been quite a few? How does this rank? Is this sort of the Watergate?
It's basically, in my view, a personal situation. In other words, people are judging the person of Benjamin Netanyahu, but not the political and economic ideas with which he has come to be identified. Those do not seem to be challenged by the same majority that elected Netanyahu repeatedly to power. That's why I very much agree that even if we're witnessing now the twilight of Netanyahu's political career, we're not witnessing the end of an era in Israeli history. If he's about to step aside or to be removed, whether now or a year from now, or even a little more than that, he will be succeeded by someone, in my view, who politically speaking will be quite similar to him, very different perhaps in his character, but not in his ideas. In terms of Netanyahu's conservatism on economics, and in terms of his hardline on Israeli-Arab affairs and on broader Middle Eastern affairs, I think we're not witnessing a great change in terms of the Israeli voters' attitudes.
Ambassador Meir, do you agree?
I want to differ. I think the era of Bibi Netanyahu is over. It's over because the charges of the police and I think the general attorney will have no choice but to only one thing is to indict our prime minister. And once he will be indicted, the political partners of this coalition will say to Bibi Netanyahu, this is the end. I agree that this will be, it might be the same coalition with this parliament. The parliament will not be dissolved. What I disagree with Jeremy, and we live in the same city, but I disagree with him, is the poll. The poll was taken by a very unobjective pollster, who is a personal pollster of Benjamin Netanyahu. He's a personal pollster, he's a pollster of the Likud, and he's a pollster of a paper which is being financed by an American, Sheldon Adelson, and it's not a paper which is really going by the rules of journalism as we know them. So the poll is very, very out of line. We will see in the coming days other polls, in my view. But generally speaking, I agree that it's not the end or the end of the era of the right in Israel. It's the end of the era of Prime Minister Netanyahu personally, because corruption is in Israel. Unlike in Italy, I was ambassador in Italy, so I can compare. Corruption in Israel is totally unacceptable by the majority of the Israelis. So we cannot tolerate corruption.
Jeremy, I want you to follow up on that. I mean, these corruption charges on their face look pretty horrendous, and a sort of backroom deals with the telecoms giant family, favors about news coverage involving not just Benjamin Netanyahu, his wife, others. This seems pretty murky stuff. How does he get out of this? I mean, he is saying he's going to go down, fight to the last, obviously.
Sure. Just before I address that, I'll just point out that I also referred to an average of the 8 polls that came out, and not just specifically the last poll. But for sure, look, the allegations are very serious. We're talking about an investigation that started with a probe back in June 2016. It only became a full-fledged investigation in December of 2016. The police recommendations that just came out this month, this is after over a year and a half of looking into this issue. But we still know that a person is innocent until found guilty. And the ambassador did mention that also in his remarks. We're not even at the level of an indictment yet. So I feel that, I'll put it this way. The Prime Minister, within a few weeks, will reach the feat of being Prime Minister, if you include his term in the 90s, at 12 years in office as Prime Minister. I don't see that changing. I don't see an end to the era of Netanyahu, not in the months ahead, and I don't think in the year ahead. The current elections are supposed to be conducted in November of 2019. I don't know if we're going to get that far, but I do think this government, which is a government that, again, has the public support, even if the Prime Minister does not, I think this government is going to last into 2019.
Amotz, as a journalist, what do you think? I mean, Shlomo Filber, the person who's in the last 24, 48 hours turned and sort of flipped and will now look like give evidence, was pretty close to Netanyahu. Does this mean potentially it gets a lot more serious going forward? And that's to you, Amotz.
I think that us journalists view the Netanyahu biography as increasingly, many of us view it as a tragedy. He likes to compare himself to Churchill, but I at least think that he's more comparable to Nixon, and I mean this not only pejoratively. He's comparable to Nixon in terms of his savvy on international affairs, and he's comparable to Nixon in terms of his utter misunderstanding of the media substance. He understands the media and has treated it from the inception of his career as an enemy. He certainly has not treated, deep inside, he seems to have not treated the media as a democratic value. And he always suspected it as being a weapon of his enemies, and he treated it as a subject of his manipulations, all the way to the extent of creating a newspaper that would camouflage as an objective newspaper while in effect serving his own career. This, I think, is the crux of a tragedy that we're now about to enter its very last chapter.
The era of fake news is not just here in the US, is what you're saying. But
no, I don't think we should confuse this with the term of fake news. That's not what this is about. This is about manipulated news. This is different. Fake news is a separate discussion. I don't think this is part of it.
Ambassador, what do you think to that?
First of all, I agree with Amotz on everything that he said right now. I want to say that Israel is going now with this Prime Minister. Before I will say something, I know this Prime Minister from childhood. We grew up together in the same neighborhood. I worked with him. He was my colleague, and then I worked under him. So I know Mr. Netanyahu quite well. One of the problems of Israel right now that Israel is going to a trouble of the Prime Minister and his party acting against Israel's democracy. I call it on my Twitter that Israel is going now through a Putinization, Erdoganization, Orbanization, not urbanization, Orbanization from the Prime Minister after the name of the Prime Minister, the Hungarian Prime Minister, and also mobilization, which is the Prime Minister of Poland. These are all nationalistic Prime Ministers who are fighting their own democracy, and our Prime Minister is on a very sloppy, very, how do you call it?
Slippery slope.
That's right. In taking Israel's democracy, fighting the media, fighting the freedom of the speech, I'm very worried about it.
Interesting. Jeremy, I want to pick up on something that was said just by Amotz a minute ago. He compared Benjamin Netanyahu to Nixon. Nixon was hated inside the country but loved abroad and did a lot in terms of foreign policy when he was facing Watergate. Do you see Benjamin Netanyahu being able to do something similar, build up wins overseas as he's embattled at home?
I mean, it's an interesting comparison, right? Because Netanyahu is not just the prime minister, he's also the foreign minister, and he spends quite a lot of time abroad. So it's actually part of his job description. But I think one of the comparisons, and I think, by the way, that's an amazing and very intriguing comparison to make. But if you are going to go ahead and make a comparison to Nixon, I think if you're looking at the level of divide between the people right now in Israel, I think that could be the comparison. You're really at a situation where you have, and again, depending what poll you want to look at, but roughly half the country loves him, half the country hates him. And again, as time goes on, it seems that he is getting more public support from his base of the right and religious parties.
Ambassador Meir's shaking his head there.
He doesn't have the support of the majority of the Israelis. Right now, his party has 30 members out of 120. The coalition has a majority, but his party, the Likud party, and then Prime Minister Netanyahu does not enjoy the support of the majority of Israel before before what happened, and definitely after we are seeing now. I totally agree with Amotz about the comparison to Watergate. You remember the Woodward and Bernstein were saying, "Look after the money." This is what we are going to see, right? This is what we are going to see right now in Israel. Look. Go after the money, and we will see the story is not over yet. The story of corruption is not over. So we have three processes here in Israel, actually. We have the foreign policy process, where Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Jeremy said it, is also the foreign minister. We have the corruption way, and we have the anti-democratic steps that Benjamin Netanyahu is taking here in Israel right now. And I'm very worried about the last one, not less than the corruption one.
Interesting you say follow the money. Amotz, you're a member of the Israeli media. Is the media going to do that? Do you feel it's a very vibrant media in Israel? Is what I'm trying to say. Is there a sense of being able to get Benjamin Netanyahu by following the money here?
That's on the technical side. I would say on the substantive side that everybody in the media is beginning to gear themselves to some kind of a summary of an era and the prediction of what will follow it. And I want to say that in terms of beginning to appreciate Netanyahu's imprint on Israeli history, we mentioned here, first of all, the universally commended and appreciated diplomatic impact. We mentioned here the very problematic political impact and the attitude towards democracy and journalism. There is a third aspect, and that's the economic aspect. On the economy, Netanyahu's imprint is extremely deep and will prove lasting. He completed the great transition of the Israeli economy from its founders' socialist legacy to their successors' capitalistic legacy, where we live today. Israel is an extremely capitalistic economy, and Netanyahu's reforms on this front as Minister of Finance last decade have been successful and universally admired. Since then, they have been followed by a new era, a new quest for social compassion, which I think is also part of the post-Netanyahu era that's only beginning now to bud and will flourish in upcoming years.
Well, it's a very great summary that you gave us. And it poses this question. If not Netanyahu, then who, Jeremy? Because he has left such a large imprint, and who could fill his shoes?
Well, I mentioned before he's a few weeks away from 12 years at the PM chair. The only one that's done more than that is Israel's founder, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister. So definitely very big shoes to fill. You have your players on the right and on the left. On the left, of course, the #1 player is Yair Lapid, who's also going to be the star witness against him. I would cry conflict of interest if I was Prime Minister Netanyahu on that. In terms of the right, you have a lot of people in the Likud that could emerge to be the next successor, to be the head of the Likud party. Right now, none of them really have a lot of public support. If you're looking at the coalition's partners, a lot of them don't have support. One of the people that I would look at is Naftali Bennett, who's the head of the Bayit Yehudi party.
The coalition's been pretty quiet, hasn't it, so far? One of my colleagues said, look for when they start making noise. They'll know that his days are numbered. Is that it? Is the coalition still strong because they feel that Netanyahu will weather this?
Yeah, the coalition has been acting as if there is nothing happening outside. Again, you would think that the coalition does not read the papers or watch television. They do, they're just not fazed by it. Again, we live in a democracy where you're innocent until proven guilty. We have passed the stage of the police recommendations, but again, we're still at the point where the state attorney is looking at it, the prosecution, the attorney general has not yet weighed in. We're before the hearing the prime minister is granted, before you have an indictment. Like I said earlier in the show, I think we're going into 2019 with this coalition, and if you look at the coalition partners, they're all acting that way.
Jeremy, just a quick follow-up. So what happens if an indictment
Sure.
is handed down? Is that when we see the coalition starting to crumble?
Yeah, that would be my bet. If you're ready to have a situation where you have an indictment, even though legally you can maintain your position of prime minister until you're convicted, I think would be very difficult for a lot of members of the coalition to be able to be at a point where it's already past the police recommendations, past the state attorney, past the attorney general, and is actually, I mean, I'll put it to you this way. Can we have a prime minister who needs to run the country while making sure that he can appear in court every day? I think we all realize that if we get to that point, then we're already going to have a different situation.
You know, there are some parallels a little bit to the political climate here in the United States, Ambassador. Obviously not exactly the same, but the political maelstrom continues here in Washington. Could Donald Trump help out Bibi Netanyahu here? They're close. Could he throw him a bone diplomatically? Would that help?
I don't think so. I think the issue of corruption is very strong here in Israel. Like American people, the Israeli people are very much against corruption, and there's nothing that can help him, like foreign policy, security policy, economic policy. I agree with Amotz. Israel's economic situation is one of the best in the Western world today, in the OECD. There's no doubt about it. But corruption stands differently. It has a different standing in the eyes of Israeli public opinion. And therefore, we will have to see in the coming days. We have to also to realize that two of his closest aides are going to testify against him. It's not something which we can take lightly, and the coalition members are seeing it. I also suspect that the third one, which is Hefetz, Nir Hefetz, might also testify against him because they don't want to sit in jail. They don't want to cover up for the prime minister. So we will see in the coming days what's going to happen on this front, on the police front and the general attorney front.
Amos, just chart the way forward for Netanyahu. What, apart from saying this is a witch hunt and there's no there, what's his defences going forward, and both political, legal and otherwise?
I don't think there is any other weapon in his quiver. He's shooting his last arrows in this regard. He will find increasingly that no matter what he does on the media front with which he feels so comfortable, the battle is shifting, or has long ago shifted, from that arena to the legal arena where none of these arrows of his are relevant.
Let's follow up on that, Jeremy. Do you believe the same, that we are, let's say it's a Shakespearean tragedy, are we in the last scene of the last act?
I don't think so. Like I said, I think this coalition is going to continue to 2019. I do not expect to see an indictment anytime soon. I think it's going to take a matter of months until we're able to get through the process of the state attorney. I think it's going to take time to schedule the hearing, especially if Prime Minister always abroad. I think by the time you have the hearing, the Attorney General goes ahead and weighs on it. We could be at the end of this year. We could be in the beginning of 2019. And in the meantime, again, this government is going to continue on the course that it's been on. And once again, Netanyahu is going to pass 12 years in office. And if this drags on long enough, he might even pass 13.
Ambassador Meir, you don't think so? You think all political careers end in failure and this is going to be a spectacular one?
Absolutely. And I want to tell you something. I envy you there in America. You have 2 terms. A president can serve only for 2 terms. There's a reason for it. Besides the checks and balances that your system have, the fact is that if you are too long in power, power corrupts. No matter what democracy you are in, power corrupts, and therefore the Israeli Knesset will have to legislate in the next government that a prime minister can serve only for 2 terms, maximum 8 years, no 1 day more, because the longer he is in power, as I said, power corrupts, and the longer you are, power corrupts more. So therefore,
Ambassador Meir in Rome, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insights. Also to you, Jeremy, in Jerusalem as well, and Amotz in New York. A fascinating discussion. We also have to apologise to Avi Bell. We lost our signal to San Diego. That's it, though, for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us. See you soon.